Okay, so today we are going to be finishing the presentation. We're going to be addressing objections, and then we're going to be discussing some final considerations, sort of the way that you would in the conclusions section of a paper. So let me pull up the slides again. I'll size this up. I think that's fine. And now I'm going to pull up my slides. I kind of was realizing this morning, I said before, funnily enough, it was an either or, right? Should it be disjunctive argument or argument from theological difficulty? And I thought, well, technically, it's just a disjunctive argument from theological difficulty. The structure really is a modus tollens. First, the disjunction, either Catholicism or non-Catholicism, but one of them is going to be true because Christianity is true. If non-Catholicism, then the only way you can find the true church reliably is if theology is perspicuous. And then another premise that there is a way you can find the true church reliably, or because if there's not, then we're going to see sort of what the consequences of that are. But theology is not perspicuous, therefore not non-Catholicism. Therefore, Catholicism. Because not non-Catholicism for our purposes equals Catholicism, because we're assuming one or the other. So that's technically the structure of this argument. What's going on? A modus tollens. So if P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. Okay. But I want to kind of make some clarifications. Because one issue that might sort of come up in people's minds from the first three parts of the presentation is that my case for the Catholic method of reliably finding the true church only works because I get to hold it to an inappropriate double standard. I say that true belief in the papacy doesn't have to be justified, but true belief in which church is true, based on your own theological acumen, that does have to be justified. Now, technically, that needs some nuance. In the previous segments of this presentation, I talked about the so-called minimal fact set challenge. What I said there was, the real standard of being able to be said to know something from a set of facts would be that if two intellectually honest people look at that set and they are, they have the perceptiveness, they have enough perceptiveness to be aware of all the facts in that set, aware of all of them, then it ought to be that they both reach the same conclusion. I don't think one could say that person A say that Presbyterianism is true on the basis of facts X, Y, and Z, if person B can come along and look at facts X, Y, and Z and not reach the same conclusion, reach the conclusion that Presbyterianism is false because, e.g., Eastern Orthodoxy is true. I would regard that as a strange use of the word no. I mean, what may be the case is those facts furnish some justification for Presbyterianism such that it's not irrational to be Presbyterian. But those same facts furnish some justification for Eastern Orthodoxy such that it's not irrational to be Eastern Orthodox either. And ditto Catholicism, and I think this is the problem in the debate. So the minimal fact set is sort of challenge. The minimal fact set challenge is basically pointing out that it almost doesn't matter how smart the people are in the equation, how, what their qualifications are, how many years they spent studying the question. It's not going to be that I can pull out some minimal fact set that any two smart people who see all those facts are going to converge on the same conclusion. It will always be whatever the fact set and whatever level of IQ or education or knowledge we're talking about on behalf of the thinkers. It'll be that one person can look at it and derive one conclusion, and the other can look at it and derive the other conclusion, which suggests that the level of justification that you need in order to have justified true belief that a given church is the true church on first order theological grounds is like really, really high. It's sky high. And so to nuance what I said, really all these positions have some measure of justification. The case for the papacy is a case. It provides some measure of justification. I don't think it meets the minimal fact set standard, because I think someone can come along and look at those same facts and reasonably disagree. And because the only other way would be that, like, they're in bad faith, where they look at those facts, but they pretend not to see what they actually do see because they're trying to get rich somehow by denying the truth. I don't think that that's very likely to be happening in the case of Eastern Orthodox apologists, say, who disagree on whether, say, Eric Ibarra's minimal facts case for the papacy it means that we sort of have Vatican I in embryo in the Church of the first millennium, right? I don't think they're in bad faith. So yeah, there is a case for the papacy. It doesn't meet the minimal fact set challenge, but it doesn't mean that it's irrational. But one thing I will be showing is that in order for this method to work reliably, under some understanding of the word reliable, the justification for your belief, that the papacy will take you to the true church doesn't need to be nearly so high as it needs to be if the method that you're using to find the true church is, just look at every church and decide which one is true based on your own independently worked out systematic theology, which in the first 3 segments of this presentation is what I argued non-Catholicism actually requires you to do. And it's the only truly reliable way of finding the true church if Catholicism is not true, if the doctrine of papal infallibility is not true. And so then there was something else I said. I said that even the Catholics are Catholics who believe in the truth of the Catholic Church on the basis of first order positive theology are just guessing, on the basis of, say, the minimal facts set case like Eric Ibarra makes. And I do sort of regret saying that, but again, the reason why I said that is I would regard it as a strange usage of the word the verb to know, that if you can know that the papacy is true based on facts X, Y, and Z, and somebody else equally aware of facts X, Y, and Z who's not in bad faith can come along and reasonably disagree such that it's rational for them to be Eastern Orthodox while it's also rational for you to be Catholic. Okay, that's all well and good, but I don't think one can be said to know that the Catholicism is true from those facts any more than one could the other person could simultaneously at the same time be said to know that Eastern Orthodoxy is true from those facts. Those facts are not decisive. They don't furnish the level of justification required for true knowledge. But to say just guessing is wrong, because they're not guessing at random. It's an educated guess. It's rational. So I mean, there's nuances that need to be sort of maintained here, and I didn't always do a good job of nuancing stuff. So now I'm going to be dealing with some objections, but first, before I do that, I have to kind of lay out what the requirements are for a reliable method of finding the true church. I think what I actually mean here is a reliable shortcut method of finding the true church. The option of just looking at each church and deciding which one is true based on your own sort of independently worked out systematic theology is sort of necessarily analytically always seen to be there, in just the same way that it's always understood that an uncle is the brother of, your mother or father. Just what it means for the church to be the true church is for it to have all correct theology. So, of course, one is, using the method of, looking at each church and deciding which one is true is always going to be there as a method. But I think the question that I'm really asking on this slide is there like a reliable shortcut method where you get to bypass all that work? And so what I'm saying is that for a shortcut, which I would argue the papacy is, it needs to be known about. It has to have some measure of publicity or advertisement as a method of finding the true church. And as we'll see, the reason why I say that is that if there is a shortcut, but nobody knows about it, because, either because it's so implausible that no one even thinks to use it or even suggests it to other people so that it has no publicity, or even if it had some small measure of publicity, people upon hearing it wouldn't bother with trying it, then it would be really as if we had a locked door and there was a key, but the key was hidden super carefully such that no one will ever find it. Well, in that scenario, that's really equivalent to there just being a locked door and no key at all. So it needs to have some measure of publicity or advertisement as a method of finding the true church. And relatedly, this is very related, it has to have some measure of plausibility or epistemic justification, even if it's not enough to pass the very high standard set by the minimal fact set challenge. It needs to be rational to some degree. It needs to be plausible enough for people to bother using it. And they can do so with a faulty rationale, like someone who studies one semester of theology and thinks now that they know the Catholic Church is true based on facts X, Y, and Z. They don't yet see how others can reasonably disagree with them on the basis of the same set of facts, or with equal awareness of that set of facts. Or because they don't have perfect assurance that it will work as far as they know, but they're making a sort of Hail Mary throw, like in that movie scene from Inception, where Ken Watanabe tells Leonardo DiCaprio, I can do the thing that you so desperately need to do, but which is like borderline impossible. And Leonardo DiCaprio is like, I'm going to need a guarantee. How do I know you can do this? And Ken Watanabe says, you don't, but I can, and I'm your only option. And so, Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't have 100% assurance that Ken Watanabe can pull it off. But at the same time, Ken Watanabe is a cool looking dude in a helicopter, right? He's not just like some disheveled vagabond who's making like crazy statements saying he can help him through magic or something. He might take a chance on Ken Watanabe, but he might not take a chance on the disheveled vagabond. So Ken Watanabe, he has some measure of plausibility, even if he's not like a sure thing as far as Leonardo DiCaprio knows. So now this is the thought experiment that I used in my original presentation for the so-called simple argument for the papacy. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a method working reliably or with high confidence. I don't actually mean, this is just a usage thing, I don't actually mean this with respect to what the user knows. I just mean the absolute reliability of the method. The same way that a gun in good working order always works when you pull the trigger, regardless of if you've ever seen a gun, if you know what a gun does, if you believe it to be loaded or not, if you believe it to be in good working order or not. So that's more so what I'm talking about here. Because I think, as will be shown, that's the more relevant standard. But let's get to that when we get to that. So for some method to work with high confidence, it is not necessary for one to know that it works with high confidence or be confident that it works with high confidence. Sorry, that's a little confusing, at least not initially. And in this case, one does know that it works, albeit by process of elimination. So now suppose we're in a curiosity shop. It's full of strange magical things, like a Harry Potter type of store almost, right? And the shopkeeper is eccentric and a little loopy, but he knows a lot about these weird things that you've never seen before, but that do genuinely remarkable things, all right? And he has a very special item called the Wumple. And a Wumple is something that we have no sort of familiarity with, no analog or precedent for. And that's because, theology is also something like that. It's not really a thing that we have like this earthly analog or counterpart that we can reduce theology to and fully understand it in terms of, right? So, so the shopkeeper, I'm the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper hands you a dozen strange items and tells you that one of them is a Wumple, and you must identify the Wumple, but only when you are very sure that you have identified the Wumple, because a wrong answer will cost you a very, very, very expensive visit to the hospital, especially if you reside in the USA. US listeners, you know what I mean. I further hand you 2 items, one of which is a magic wand that supposedly identifies Wumples, and the other of which is a heavy, dense technical manual that goes on for over 3,000 pages about Wumple details. Now, I further tell you that with one or the other of these 2 items, even an average person, a person of no remarkable depth or keenness of mind or intuition, even an average person can identify a Wumple with high confidence and no great amount of preparation. Actually, they can do it in 5 minutes. You scan through the manual, but it's full of technical jargon and diagrams you can't make heads or tails of. This is kind of like the manual that you had to build the strange aircraft from, right? You would quickly ask, and it's analogous to having to find out which church is true based on your own sort of independently worked out systematic theology. You quickly ascertain that you would not be able to master its content even after a lifetime of study. But assuming that the shopkeeper is truthful and correct in all that he says, assume you just get to know that, you get to stipulate that. Do you know that the wand will let you identify the Wumple with high confidence? The answer is yes, if you know that the manual won't. If you know that it won't, right? And so that's kind of the contention that I've been making in this argument, is that theology is not perspicuous. It doesn't furnish, sort of one's own ability. The method of finding the true church through one's own personal theological acumen does not represent a reliable way of finding the true church. So even though we don't have high confidence that the wand will work, we have some reason to believe that it will work. Contrast the wand with a random item, for example, a crumpled up newspaper on the floor. One would think to try and use the wand to identify a Wumple, because after all, the shopkeeper said it works, and the shopkeeper knows something about these strange things, or at least presumably does. But one would never think to try and use a crumpled newspaper to try to identify a Wumple, expecting it to behave in the same way as a wand. This is true even on the bizarre supposition that using a crumpled piece of newspaper turns out to work equally well as the magic wand that vibrates over the Wumple in the same way as with the magic wand, right? If using a piece of newspaper is not sufficiently plausible as a method, one will not even think to use it. And even if some random passerby suggests that you use a crumpled up newspaper instead of the wand, or like your crazy friend that you took to the store with you, who you know doesn't know anything about Wumples, suggests that you use a crumpled up newspaper instead, you would probably not think this alternate method was worth trying, since there is no reason to suppose it would work. And the passerby is not prima facie as credible as the owner of the curiosity shop when it comes to Wumple identification. This shows that even a method that is advertised as a method of finding the true church will not be used if it does not have some minimal level of justification. And in practice, we'll also find that it just won't be advertised as a method either. So, why it is appropriate for me to maintain the double standard. On the one hand, to say that for the method of finding the true church by submitting to Rome works, 100 times out of 100, assuming that Catholicism is true, and doesn't require enough justification to pass the minimal facts test in order for it to work all the time, just like a gun always works if it's in good working order, whether or not you realize it does. And I say, on the other hand, that by contrast, if you are trying to find the true church through personal theological acumen, the minimal facts challenge suggests that the level of justification that you need to find it reliably is incredibly high, because it turns out that when we're playing that game of trying to find the true church using our personal theological acumen, really smart people can look at the same set of facts and disagree in good faith, I presume. Eric Ibarra makes his minimal facts set case. Ubi Petrus comes along, looks at the same case, and says, I'm not convinced. I think from where I stand, it seems both of them seem rational in their respective beliefs, however opposing they are. But that also means you can't really know either conclusion based on those facts alone, at least by that sort of test set by the minimal facts set challenge. So when various methods of finding the true church are essentially conceived as instructions, even if only vague instructions like just read your Bible and pray over it, it becomes evident that when we compare the instruction, submit to the Bishop of Rome, and determine which church has the most correct theology, really by investigating every single issue exhaustively forever, they each require a different level of justification to work reliably, where we assume that the version of Christianity associated with each one to be true. So we're also, to make it a fair comparison, in each case when we ask the question of how much justification the method of personal theological acumen needs, we're also assuming that Catholicism is not true. And when we ask the question of how much justification the method of submitting to Rome needs, we're also assuming that Catholicism is true. All right. So if Catholicism is true, then submit to the Bishop of Rome contains enough information within it as an instruction that if you use it, it will take you to the true church reliably, in the sense of 100 times out of 100, whether you realize it, it will or not. Now, in this case, the level of justification required for the doctrine of papal infallibility only needs to be high enough that you, for whatever reason, whether it be a faulty rationale or my disjunctive argument or a DiCaprio-like desperation, find that you have sufficient justification to use the method. It does not have to be so high that it meets the minimal fact set challenge. Now, if some non-Catholic version of Christianity is true instead, determine which church has the most correct theology only works for some people, most of whom are probably right only by chance. For example, they were born into the true church and never seriously reflected on theology. They unthinkingly stumbled in, or they used the faulty rationale to find it. The minimal fact set challenge suggests that the level of justification required for the method of theological discernment to work reliably, in the sense of 100 times out of 100, or 99 times out of 100, let's say, is prohibitively high. It can be seen that this has to do with its intrinsic informational limitations as a method, rather than any arbitrary imposition of a double standard on my part. Now, earlier in the presentation, I made a claim which might have been shocking to some Catholics, and I explained this whole thing. Catholics are just guessing, well, only in the sense of the minimal fact set challenge. I think it's rational for Catholics to be Catholic on the basis of whatever first order positive case they make for it. And who knows, there might be one that is really so decisive that it really just forces you to draw the conclusion of Catholicism, but I haven't seen it yet. In other words, I haven't seen that actual minimal fact set that reasonable people can't disagree about, in favor of Catholicism. I'm not saying it doesn't exist or couldn't be brought out in the future. I'm just saying I haven't seen it. And sort of for epistemic reasons that I covered, I'm going to provisionally be skeptical about its existence until I actually see it. So now here's another objection. It's an important objection. It's one that a good friend basically made to me in the wake of my first 4-hour presentation on this topic, the true church and the not easiness of theology. And basically what he said was, if I can paraphrase him, is, the Catholic method only appears to be a reliable method because I start on the assumption that Catholicism is true. But your argument can be, my argument can be mirrored in such a way that any non-Catholic method could be made to seem equally reliable if we get to just assume that its associated non-Catholic church is true. So what he's saying is, you can really find a shortcut. You can articulate some candidate shortcut from a, let's say, Presbyterian position. And if you get to assume that Presbyterianism is true, then you can say that, well, there is this shortcut that works reliably on Presbyterianism just as much as there is a shortcut that works reliably on Catholicism, which I said, critical to my argument is the idea that only on Catholicism is there a shortcut that works reliably, and on no other position is there one. So this is a significant objection. So at the beginning of this series, I made the case that only a method like go and figure out every theological issue for yourself can ensure that you find the true church reliably, assuming that we reject the doctrine of papal infallibility. Whether or not it is true that this is the only appropriate method, I grant that most non-Catholic pastors or priests would not be likely to actually suggest this if an inquirer asked them, what does one do to find the true church? As a matter of real-world probabilities, the non-Catholic pastor or priest would be more likely to say something like, if they're Protestant, you have to prayerfully immerse yourself in Scripture and find out which church is the most biblical. Or if one of the non-Catholic ancient churches, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, maybe Assyrian Church of the East, maybe even some Anglicans, you have to find out which church is most faithful to the church fathers, councils, and apostolic traditions, and or while also striking some kind of a reasonable compromise with modernity. I don't know. They'll say different things, right? But they're not going to say, go and figure out every theological issue for yourself. It would certainly be a caricature if I would say that really every non-Catholic pastor actually tells people to do that, right? All right. So does this prove that my argument can be mirrored? Can we say that a shortcut exists on Presbyterianism or Eastern Orthodoxy or anything else? Now, it can be seen that, there's a limitation, which is basically the candidate shortcut method is either going to be generic or specific. If generic, it lacks sufficient discriminatory power that it will reliably guide you to the true church absent a high level of justification, at or near the level required by the minimal fact set challenge. But if it's overly specific, it's going to lack the kind of plausibility that you need in order for it to even be entertained as a solution, or bothered with as a solution, attempted as a solution, because it would be like the suggestion of a crumpled up newspaper instead of the magic wand. The magic wand is a long shot. It's a Hail Mary, but a crumpled up newspaper, it's like, Ken Watanabe is a long shot. He's a Hail Mary, but disheveled vagabond, So this is what I'm suggesting is the sort of Scylla and Charybdis that the objection that you can make a shortcut work for another church on the same assumptions that I get to use for Catholicism faces. So something like, find out which church is the most biblical is probably not specific enough to guide you into, say, the Reformed Baptist Church, if that's what he really wants you to do. And, find out which one is most faithful to the church fathers and the councils and things and the apostolic traditions. Well, you might be Eastern Orthodox. You might be Oriental Orthodox. You might be Eastern Orthodox, but you might be true Orthodox instead of World Orthodox, or vice versa, whichever one you're assuming to be the true one. Or you might be Catholic. It's lacking discriminatory power, such that even if we assume Eastern Orthodoxy to be true, this method doesn't reliably guide you to the Eastern Orthodox Church absent a high level of justification, the kind of thing we're trying to avoid when we put forward a shortcut. Now, but one might say that, for the comparison to be fair, the pastor needs to basically, now we're gonna see whether a more specific shortcut will work. And the more specific it is, the less plausible it's going to be. If you say something like, you have to find the true church, you have to if the Reformed Baptist pastor says the shortcut to finding the true church is that you have to find the church that has the most Augustinian conception of God's sovereignty, and which also recognizes that baptism is only appropriate for adults. The question of whether this bears any necessary relationship to the true church is basically, begging the question that sort of one can see on independent grounds that these things are, like always going to be part of the true church, that these things are true. It's really, I don't think it actually works as a shortcut that lets you not have to do that whole independently worked out systematic theology. Or if you say something kind of crazy, which would be like, for an Eastern Orthodox, like, just always submit to the Bishop of Jerusalem, Orthodox Bishop of Jerusalem, because he's just sort of, every single one of them has always been theologically impeccable, as it were, for contingent reasons. Even though they're not infallible, it just turns out, they're not necessarily always right. They just turn out to have always gotten it right. No one's probably going to suggest that, because the only way that shortcut would have any buy-in is if it is clear that there's some kind of necessary relationship between taking that shortcut and finding the true church, where there is just not. If you ask the Orthodox Bishop of Jerusalem, are you infallible? He's going to say no. So even if it works to submit to him, that's not the basis on which you submit to him. Whereas if a priest suggests the shortcut, a Catholic priest suggests the shortcut of submit to the Bishop of Rome, now the question is whether there's any necessary relationship between doing that and finding the true church. And it turns out that at least a case can be made that there is one. That is quite different from all the other, suggested specific shortcuts, because they don't have any they don't have any necessary relationship between taking the shortcut and finding the true church. That really sort of lets you bypass doing a whole lot of other theological work. Whereas if you're just making, like, say, the minimal facts case for the papacy, it can support the idea that there is a necessary relationship between taking this shortcut and finding the true church reliably. That this is more plausible as a shortcut than any of the other shortcuts. Take a quick pause here. This might be an issue worth exploring a little more. I mean, there's wrinkles here where any candidate non-Catholic shortcut is not going to be as timeless as the submit to Bishop of Rome one. Like, it's going to be seen that it doesn't work in every age, and one would sort of assume a God-made or God-furnished way of finding the true church reliably would always be the same from age to age. For the thesis that there is always a shortcut on the assumption that Presbyterianism is true, it's almost like the shortcut has to change depending on whatever age you're in. Like, for example, it's not going to work to find out who has the most Augustinian conception of God's sovereignty, before Augustine exists. And so on. The shortcut would have to be something different in each age. And in some ages, assuming Presbyterianism is true, it would be something like, just go found a sect based on the idea of, Augustinian predestination, but it's not called that yet. And that, well, I guess does infant baptism. But if we're saying Reformed baptism is true, then it's based on Augustinian predestination, and it just doesn't do infant baptism. And see, the thing about something like that is, at least at that time, it's so wild that no one would think to try it. In general, these things are not widely advertised as methods. That's why I say that it would be just as if there was a locked door, but you're saying, a shortcut exists, except nobody knows about it. Why doesn't anyone know about it? Because they're not widely advertised as methods. I suppose just because they are just seen as begging the question. But anyway, yeah, this is something that perhaps I could do to think a little bit more about. But so far, I think everything I'm saying is correct. So, all right, let's keep going. The other thing about the Catholic shortcut is that it's genuinely reliable in the sense of everybody, in a different sense, in the sense of inter-rater reliability, different but related. Everybody who is asked to find out who the Bishop of Rome is will always tell you the same person, basically. Whereas if the instruction is find out which church is true based on your own theological best guess, everyone's going to give you a different answer, so it's not reliable in that sense. Or which church is the most beautiful, or which church has the holiest people, it's not reliable in that sense. So if you're beginning from the assumption that there has to be a reliable way to find the true church, and you know that nothing else works, then the Catholic shortcut, however implausible, is reliable. And so you can sort of leverage that knowledge to know that it is true, regardless of how otherwise implausible it may seem to you to be. The same is not true. No, it could be true for those other specific non-Catholic candidate shortcuts, but they're not widely advertised as methods. So, for example, is it well known that, at least among Christians, who have some basic level of interest in theology, that Catholics believe the Pope to be infallible? Yes, it's well known. And so that's the same as to say that it's well known that Catholics at least say that the method of submitting to the Bishop of Rome works as a shortcut method to find the true church, because an infallible leader is not going to be the infallible leader of a false church. Whereas, some other, I'm open to hearing, suggestions and counter arguments and specific challenges, but I'm not aware of a candidate non-Catholic shortcut that has like the same level of publicity or advertisement as the Catholic shortcut has. But as we're going to see, if it turns out that, if one wants to make the case that, fine, the Catholic shortcut is widely advertised, but it doesn't have a super high level of plausibility to where enough people will bother with using it. And therefore, it's really just as if there was a hidden key, because, maybe in this case, we will say there is a key in plain sight, but for whatever reason, most people can't recognize it as a key. You can make that case, and I will address that too. So, if the case of the Orthodox and Protestant shortcuts to finding the true church is like the case of a door for which the key has been hidden, the case of the Catholic shortcut is like the case of a locked door beside which lies a key that, for whatever reason, is thought by many not to be the right one. This latter situation is still an informational improvement over the former, especially if one has reason to suppose, as in the Wumple analogy, that either this key works or something else does, and that something else turns out not to work. Now, this is the objection that I just spoke of, that the papacy is also like a hidden key, or just like an unrecognizable key, or like an unrecognizable mark or tag. And there's a certain way where, an unrecognizable mark or tag is sort of a contradiction in terms, right? Because recognizability is sort of intrinsic to a distinguishing mark. So in order for you to use a method, you have to, one, know that it exists. So I'm addressing this objection, and I'm reiterating some things. In order for you to use a method, you have to, one, know that it exists, and you have to, two, believe that it will work. Arguably, not enough people believe that it will work, that is the papal method, or know that it works. And a situation where there is a key, but most people can't recognize it as a key, is arguably no better than a situation with a hidden or missing key. And this objection is especially forceful if one concedes my premise that theology is super hard to figure out, but with the twist that it's so hard to figure out that most people can't even figure out that it's hard to figure out. Because I think I said earlier that, all you kind of have to do is realize, well, theology is really hard. You don't know what's going on, but assuming God is faithful, you can assume now that there's a way to find the true church that doesn't rest on your acumen. But what if theology turns out to be so hard that even for good faith reasons, people don't even realize that they're wrong, like a Dunning-Kruger effect? I don't know if that ever really replicated, but the idea was there can be people who are so clued out in a given topic or subject that they don't even know that they don't know very much about it. They think they're experts and they're not. So what if theology is that hard to figure out that even a method that sort of relies on your being able to know your limits and seek help won't work, because you'll just even without trying to deceive yourself, think you've got it figured out when you really don't. So that, that's a good objection. So even assuming that the papacy is what you should do if theology is hard to figure out, it turns out that as a matter of fact, most people aren't using the papacy, or at least are not using it because they realize their theological limits, which is, the basis on which I say you should. So even if there is this supposedly reliable way to find the true church on Catholicism, it turns out not to be a meaningful improvement over the state of affairs in which there isn't one, or at least, so it could be argued, and then sort of non-Catholicism is off the hook for not having a reliable way to find the true church, because Catholicism, even if it technically has one, like in terms of outcomes, the situation is no better, even if we assume Catholicism to be true. All right. So first note so here's a principles-based response I can make to that objection. It's looking at the means rather than the ends. It's, I would say, deontological as opposed to consequentialist, if one is familiar with that theological or philosophical terminology. But I wouldn't really like to say deontological, because I think it means, could be wrong, but I think it means having to do with duties. And I don't want to say that God has duties toward us per se, but I will say that based on sort of principles, we know God is good, and that is relevant to the question of whether or not there's a reliable way to find the true church, because assuming that there is a true church, God wants you to find it. If he's good, he's also going to make sure there's a way for you to find it reliably, at least someone could argue. And therefore, if we know for these sort of principle-based reasons that God will have made a reliable way to find the true church, then we can validly deduce its existence regardless of how many people end up taking it. Especially if we know that people don't take it for what always turn out to be good faith reasons. So that's just a little preview. Let me just kind of keep going through these slides. So first note in the principles-based response that doesn't look at outcomes or ends, but is just looking at the means. And sort of whether we can say God has, I don't want to say done his duty, but whether God has behaved in a way that accords with what we have reason to believe he will have behaved, as it were, based on our knowledge of God's nature. I.e., he will have provided a reliable way to find the true church if he's good, hypothetically. So first note how logically there can be a way to find the true church without people having enough justification to believe in it to pass the minimal fact set test. As long as, one, people are broadly aware of it, and two, it has enough plausibility that it is rational to use it. I think it's rational to believe in Eric Ibarra's minimal facts case for the papacy. Even if I don't know, I could say that you can know that it's true. At least not by the minimal fact set test. Second, note how from the goodness of God, you can validly deduce that there would be a reliable way to find the true church, regardless of how many people end up taking it, as I did in the so-called simple argument for the papacy. So I want to run through these arguments really quick. I think they're worth running through. There's one argument that's this original simple argument, and then the other one is the revised simple argument. I'll start with the simple argument. I think the simple argument is really fine. I revised the simple argument to make some of the premises into tautologies, and I think I did that because I was concerned to show the validity of the argument, to highlight the validity where that might be called into question. But I think the original argument works just fine. So number one, there is a true church. Two, it's truly important for all people to identify the true church, including average people. It's truly important for all people to identify the true church reliably, including average people. And truly important meaning it's necessary to maximize one's closeness with God. You could say and or one's chances of salvation, but I think even just maximizing your closeness with God is fine. Now, if it's truly important for the average person to identify the true church reliably, then God will have ensured that it is realistically possible for the average person to identify the true church reliably. Note the consequences of saying it's not important for the average person to find it reliably. It suggests that it's not necessary to maximize your closeness with God. If it's not necessary to maximize your closeness with God, should it be worth bothering with? I mean, I suppose it's just something you could regard it as something optional. Yeah, I don't know. The Catholic Church is the only church claiming that there is a method to identify the true church with reliably that doesn't rest on personal theological acumen, and hence it's realistically possible for even the average person to use this method, at least in the present day and during most points in history. It is not realistically possible for the average person to identify the true church reliably based on personal theological acumen, and then it's just making an exception for this kind of second order style argument. And then conclusion one, the Catholic Church is the true church. So in other words, again, if we're just assuming there has to be a reliable way to find it, there's only one. Doesn't mean it has to strike you as plausible, at least initially, but there's only one, which is the papacy. Everything else is not reliable in the sense that 10 people will give you 10 different answers, but the papacy, who's the Pope, everyone gives you the same answer. The revised simple argument, again, is working tautologically. There's a true church if God so wants the average person to be able to find the true church, that he will ensure there is a way for the average person to find the true church reliably. Then he will ensure that there is a way for the average person to find the true church reliably. God so wants the average person to be able to find the true church that he will ensure there is a way for the average person to find the true church reliably. Therefore, we can conclude that God has ensured there is a way for the average person to find the true church reliably. On Catholicism, there is a way for the average person to find the true church reliably, that is by identifying the current Bishop of Rome. There is no other way to find the true church reliably, either on Catholicism or on non-Catholicism. Therefore, Catholicism is true. Therefore, at least no widely advertised way that works reliably. Therefore, Catholicism is true. The Catholic Church is the true church. So, continuing my sort of principle-based defense against the objection. If it turned out the reason people didn't take... See, let's be sensitive to another implication of this debate here. I would never want to, speak of, quote-unquote, indicting God. But there is a certain way where it's like, if there is not a reliable way to find the true church, there is a sense of lack of provision. And it almost could be taken, as a sort of... an attempt to indict God, right? Or to attack the successfulness of his provision or something like that. And so, it's not an accusation, that there's no reliable way to find the true church. It's not an accusation it's not a statement one should necessarily make lightly, and sort of in defense of God's provision. What I will suggest is that people, in many cases, probably don't take advantage of his way of finding the true church for reasons that are, they could be said to be either original sin or just somehow adjacent to it, in the sense that original sin is speaking to our tendency to rely on ourselves rather than God, like all the time for everything. I think it's because we don't really trust God with our hearts. We don't trust anyone. We're fearful of being wounded. We don't make that leap of faith all the time. We prefer to, believe that things have natural causes, and we prefer to rely on ourselves because that is predictable. And that gives us power and the ability to know and predict and control. And so people might over-rely on themselves to find the true church, even if they sort of realize, and I'm not an exception to this, even if they realize that this field is objectively difficult, and doesn't that suggest that maybe God would have made a way that lets you bypass this, a shortcut? And we sort of say, like, no, he won't have done for us. He won't have done that. But maybe he did, but I can't take that chance. I got to rely on myself. And it could be that, now I say it's sinful. I don't mean like I'm not sinful because I'm Catholic and you are because you aren't. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's more so in that kind of sin that all of us humans fall victim to all the time because of what you might call original sin. And Catholics are no exception to it. I'm no exception to it. And but it's not the sort of thing that really counts as a good reason as far as, any hypothetical attempt to indict God. It's like, it's not God's fault if people are just like irrationally overly reliant on themselves. And so if it turned out that, there was a reliable way to find the true church, and the reason why many people didn't take advantage of it was, or even sort of most people, if we're asking, did they take advantage of it for the right reasons, let's say, because of a knowledge of their limits, as opposed to their own confidence in their ability to, say, make a first order case for Catholicism. I don't know if the reason why they don't take God up on this offer, if they don't take advantage of it, is reasons that are like sinful or somehow sin adjacent. I don't know that you can indict God for that any more than you can indict him for the fact that not everyone is a believer in Jesus due to reasons of personal sin. Maybe some people are they have invincible ignorance or good faith ignorance, but other people, they sort of suppress the truth in unrighteousness. In all those ways that sort of, when people have near-death experiences of going to hell, for example, they often speak of being convicted that they knew the truth the whole time, but they didn't act on it. But in life, if you had asked them, do you believe in God? They'll say no, and I really think it's because I wasn't given enough evidence. But for whatever reason, their mind turns when they experience that near-death experience, and they feel convicted by their own conscience. Maybe the same thing would be true regarding, sort of. I'm not it's all complicated. I'm not suggesting that by itself automatically not submitting to the Pope means you're going to hell and are going to have that experience. Please don't misunderstand me. But I'm saying, as far as your sort of your own conscience becoming aware of things that were actually missing the mark, even if in life you weren't conscious of it, I can imagine that sort of one's failure to take God up on the offer of a reliable way to find the true church might fall into that category as triggering those sort of convictions of your conscience, if that makes any sense. So now, third note, that if Catholicism is not true, then basically the only way to find out which church is true is to do theology, but God can't make theology easy because theoretically it comes from it flows from his own nature, or at least many of the issues of theology do. They're not contingent. The hinge issues of theology, like the Miaphysite controversy, Chalcedonian Christology, is Jesus, is he two natures in one hypostasis, or is he one nature? And then the filioque, does the Holy Spirit proceed from both the Father and the Son, or from the Father only? Or justification, what does it take for one to get right with God? All of these things can be seen, to ultimately flow from the nature of God, and to be the sort of thing that one can't really change. And you can't make physics easier to understand without changing it, because then you would just be oversimplifying it. Now, God could change physics, but I don't know that he could change theology, especially not those things that flow from his own nature, which is immutable, i.e. unchangeable. So, if Catholicism is not true, then the only way to find out which church is true is to do theology. But God can't make theology easy, so the only thing he can have done is just make a reliable authority. Basically, if it's binary, as between, if there's no middle ground, as between believe something on your own authority, or believe it on someone else's, then if you're not actually competent to have justified true belief on your own authority, the only thing God can do instead is give you a reliable authority, whether you recognize it or not. And so he's arguably done the most that logically can be done. Like, he can't make a square circle. He can only, one might say, God can only do logically possible things, at least in our reality, the reality that we can perceive and experience. The logical alternative to taking something on your own authority would seem to be accepting it on somebody else's. So all God could do was make it possible to accept it on somebody else's. But if theology is so hard to figure out that most people can't figure out that it's hard to figure out, then God has arguably still done the most that he can do, the most that logically could be done. Like, what was he supposed to do besides prove an infallible papacy? Change theology to make it easy enough that you can figure out the true church on your own? To the extent that theology just flows from his own nature, it logically cannot be changed, since his nature is unchangeable. Could he have made everybody 30 IQ points smarter? I suppose so, which might help, or in light of the minimal fact set problem, it might not. But assuming God has whatever valid reasons he has for not doing that, he's not going to do that. So let's take a little pause here.